Chapter 6, The British Invasion. The morning of Thursday, June 23 was one of nearly frantic activity. Harry rose from bed at just before 9 a.m., showered quickly, dressed even quicker, and practically sprinted downstairs to eat breakfast. Kreacher, knowing this was his last opportunity to do battle against the mongrel half-blood, had made what appeared to be a delicious breakfast, enough that Harry forgot who he was dealing with, and bit into an innocent-looking donut. Unfortunately, that donut happened to be filled, not with cream or jam, but with mayonnaise. Retching, Harry tried to wash the taste out of his mouth with what looked like pumpkin juice, but which was in fact carefully diluted muddy rainwater, not willing to take a chance on the bacon or eggs, for only God knew what the little nutcase had done to them, but it probably wasn't pleasant. Harry banished the table's centerpiece, a creepy black iron vase embossed with creepier images depicting either torture or extremely kinky sex. Harry didn't know which was more inappropriate for the dining table, at the elf, and made himself some oatmeal after firing a scourgify into his mouth. He did not, however, feel that it was necessary to warn Sirius or Remus of the sabotaged meal, checking only to ensure that Kreacher hadn't put powdered silver or something actually harmful into the food before sitting back to watch the show. It was only fair, he thought, since he was certain the two older wizards had tried to use him as a Kreacher minesweeper, by waiting until he had gone down to eat before descending themselves. Actually, he mused, watching the elf dodge hexes from, and hurl insults at, two enraged wizards, Kreacher definitely had a bit of marauder in him, even if it was tempered by Wahlburger Black's unrepentant bigotry and malicious intent. Finally, the elf retreated, and the marauders settled down, as much as the two marauders ever settled down, that is. Neither had yet noticed the charm Harry had used to tie their shoelaces together as soon as they were seated. That, he figured, would be the one last prank he played on them before his departure that afternoon. Excusing himself to go pack, he listened closely for the telltale sound of two pranksters tripping and falling, and grinned broadly as he heard Sirius's loud, "Bollocks. One of these days I'm going to kill that damn elf." Harry didn't have much to pack, and what he did have was packed away very quickly, as he could now use simple charms to do the work for him. He was slightly worried about Hedwig. It was too far of a journey for her to fly, but owls generally reacted poorly to portkeys. It was unavoidable, though, she would simply have to suck it up. He knew she'd be even more irritated by the fact that she'd have to make the trip under a glamour. She would appear to be a large parrot, which he was certain she would find undignified. He packed plenty of owl treats to make sure he'd be able to get back in her good graces. This did not save him from a haughty hoot and one last vengeful peck, hard enough to draw blood, as he closed her cage. As he finished up, his thoughts drifted to Hermione and Ron. He had not told them of his summer plans, or even that he had left the tender care of the Dursleys, and he was not going to do so. What left him slightly surprised at first, though, was that he did not feel even remotely guilty about it, though even a brief reflection gave him ample reason to keep his plans secret. He knew that Hermione would immediately try to talk him out of it. After all, Dumbledore had told him to remain at number 4 Privet Drive, and to her, that made it practically gospel, despite there being no good reason why the headmaster of a school should have any say in his holiday plans, and then, failing that, would inform Dumbledore that his wishes were being ignored. This, of course, would lead to Dumbledore tracking him down, pulling the disappointed grandpa, schoolteacher, wise old wizard routine, and finding some way to ensure that he could not leave number 4. Ron would first immediately tell Hermione, and then somehow find a way to be jealous of Harry's good fortune, conveniently forgetting that he had gone on a trip to Egypt the previous summer, a trip about which he had boasted frequently and at great length throughout the previous school year. Either way, Harry's plans would be ruined and his friendships stained by the unavoidable betrayal of his confidences, though neither of them would consider their inevitable reactions as such. No, Harry had no intention of letting either of his closest friends in on his plans. This was to be his adventure, and maybe he would tell them about it on the train ride back to Hogwarts. Clearing his head of such weighty thoughts, Harry noticed suddenly that he had been done packing for quite some time. He went back downstairs to have one last chat with Sirius and Remus, who were currently reading the newspaper in the sitting room. Rather, Remus was reading the newspaper, and Sirius was trying to distract him by attempting, badly, to juggle what looked to be quite expensive ornaments. After shattering and reparoing all 3 ornaments for the 5th time, Sirius gave up, and turned his full attention to Harry, who was just then walking into the room. "Oi, Harry, lad, Sirius called, doing a fairly good impression of Hagrid. Take a look at this. Sirius held out a small mirror, and Harry took it in his hand. Thanks, Sirius, but I'm pretty sure no amount of primping is going to get my hair to lay flat, Harry joked. Remus cracked a grin and Sirius barked out a laugh. Oh good one, godson of mine, Sirius said, still chuckling a bit. I have one, too. These are communication mirrors. Just look into it and say my name, and we'll be able to talk at any distance. Sort of like a portable flute. Brilliant. Harry almost shouted. Even after 3 years of exposure to the magical world, he was still constantly surprised at the number of clever spells and artifacts. I was worried about how we'd stay in touch, since it's clearly too far for an owl, and if you're hunting the rat, you won't always have access to a flute. Harry immediately cast an unbreakable charm on the mirror. It wouldn't protect against spellfire, but it would keep it from being broken if he dropped it or fell down with the mirror in his pocket. Remus gave a satisfied nod, approving of Harry's foresight. Sirius, apparently having never thought of this precaution, surreptitiously performed the same charm on his mirror, but the sly grin shot between Harry and Remus were clear indications that he had been caught. I'll call you on the mirror after I get my apparition license, Harry said, and any time I have news or plan on going on a day trip. And I guess if I just fancy a chat, since it's going to be so easy to call. Good idea. Sirius and I were actually going to ask you to do just that, Remus said, pleased that Harry was not just willing, but excited to keep in contact. Few other teenage boys would have the same consideration. The marauders at that age certainly wouldn't. We'll call you with updates on the rat hunt, and with any information we hear about Dumbledore, Hogwarts, or your friends. Also, he continued, presenting Harry with a plum-sized bouncy ball, here is your portkey to Philadelphia. It'll go off the first time you say, the British are coming, after bouncing it once. One more thing, Harry, Sirius said, his countenance somewhat more somber than normal. This, he held out his hand, and resting in his palm was a thin bronze ring, is an emergency portkey. It will take you back here, right to this sitting room, from anywhere in the world. If you get in trouble, say the activation phrase, sanctuary, and it will get you back to safety. And don't worry, Remus and I are also carrying one each. We made it last night, after you went to bed, Remus said. See the runes etched on the inside of the band? They will make the portkey charm last as long as the ring is intact, and the runes on the outside of the band will protect it against melting, cutting, or being crushed. We used to carry portkeys like this during the war against Voldemort. In fact, the only reason your parents didn't use them to escape that night was that Voldemort had laid down a powerful anti-portkey jinx over the house. That's why Sirius had to fly in on his motorcycle. Thanks, you two, Harry said as he slipped the ring onto his left little finger, where it immediately became invisible, both astonished and touched at how much effort the two men, whom he actually barely knew, were putting into making sure he had a fun, safe summer. Being looked after by people who actually cared about him was a new but entirely welcome feeling, and Harry knew that this year would be the first time he'd ever almost regret leaving for Hogwarts in September. Harry gave each marauder a tight hug, then grasped his trunk's handle and Hedwig's cage, and bounced the ball, arming the portkey. Thank you so much for everything, Harry said, suddenly emotional. I'm going to miss you guys. Remus and Sirius were both visibly blinking back tears, also somewhat overcome by the nature of the situation. Harry was, after all, their best friend's only heir, and virtual doppelganger, their student, their de facto ward, at least from now on, and the closest thing either man had to a son, and they were now saying goodbye after just barely getting to know him. Don't do anything I wouldn't do, Sirius called, while Remus simultaneously said, try to stay out of trouble. The three broke into laughter, and Harry, grinning, called out the activation phrase for the portkey. The British are coming. Chapter 7. Breakfast in America. As soon as he finished calling out the portkey's activation phrase, Harry felt the signature hook in the gut, jolting sensation, a wave of nausea, and then found himself sprawled out on a shiny tiled floor. An amused middle-aged couple helped him to his feet, and handed him Hedwig's cage. I know it's good to be here, but there's still no call for kissin' the tile, the man joked in a distinct Texan accent. Even to Harry's relatively unpracticed ear, that drawl was unmistakable. Not that it mattered, for the man's cowboy hat, bolo tie, and denim shirt would have been a dead giveaway in any case. Chuckling genially. At least wait until you can get at the actual ground outside. You all right there, son? Asked the woman kindly, after rolling her eyes at her husband. That must have been your first international portkey. Go on up to that desk, and show them your passport. If you have any trouble, just ask me or my miscreant of a husband here. The woman pointed to a large desk, above which hung a sign that stated, Philadelphia International Airport, International Portkey Arrival Terminal, Customs. All travelers must present passports and baggage for inspection. Thank you, ma'am, Harry said gratefully, blushing slightly. Despite his decidedly ungraceful entrance and Hedwig's annoyed glare, the trip was already looking up, less than 10 seconds in America, and people were already helping him. Harry walked over to the line in front of the desk, and waited a few moments before being waved over to the nearest available agent, a tall, shapely woman with dark skin and hair puffed out into a spherical afro. Remus and Sirius had made a stop before going to number 4 to get Harry a passport using a cutout of a photo he had taken of the trio at school. They had skipped the normal waiting period by simply confounding the bureaucrats and backdating the application by several months. The baggage inspection took only a few seconds. The woman ran her wand over Harry's trunk and nodded, apparently satisfied. Harry only had to say how long he'd be in the country, a couple of months, but in Philadelphia for just a few weeks, and then briefly remove the glamour on Hedwig so that the agent could ensure that Hedwig was just a post owl, rather than something illegal or dangerous. Oh, thank God it's only an owl, she sighed upon seeing Hedwig's true form, clearly relieved. You absolutely would not believe the creatures that people try to smuggle in. Last week some psycho tried to sneak in a cockatrice disguised as a poodle. Damn thing tried to bite my hand off. Anyway, is there anything else I can help with, kiddo? The customs agent asked. Yes actually, Harry replied. Can you tell me the best way to get to City Hall? I'm looking to take the apparition license exam. Yeah, sure, she answered. You can either go the non-magical way, that is, the regional rail, which departs from the airplane terminals every half hour, and costs about $5 or $6, or I can make you a portkey. It's free for destinations within the city, but some people don't feel up to another portkey so soon after an international one. Anyway, you might want to stop and check into a hotel first, to drop off your luggage. Most of them will give you an early check-in, if spare rooms are already prepared for arrivals. Since you'll only be in Philly for a few weeks, I'd recommend one of the inns, rather than one of the big, expensive hotels. Harry considered it briefly. Stopping at an inn first was an excellent idea, and he would definitely do that. Remus and Sirius had already reserved a room for him at the decidedly non-magical Alexander Inn, which was located conveniently close to City Hall and the rest of Center City, while still being a little bit out of the way, to help him stay incognito. Transportation, however, was the real question. On the one hand, Hedwig wouldn't like it. On the other hand, even disguised as a parrot, she would draw attention. The Texan couple hadn't seemed to notice his scar, and the customs agent hadn't batted an eye when she read his name on his passport, but if he unnecessarily drew attention to himself, word might find its way back to Dumbledore. Caution won out. He simply wasn't willing to risk his whole trip by traveling in public more than he had to. I'll take the portkey, please, he said. Can you set it for 12th and Market? This was a good option, he thought. He hadn't actually told the woman where he was staying, and that intersection was only 3 blocks from his destination, and, most importantly, was closer to several other hotels than the inn he had chosen. If she was questioned as to his whereabouts, someone would have to search several large hotels before getting to where he was staying, and hopefully he'd be gone by the time they found out that far. She took out a short length of rope, tying one end to a bar on Hedwig's cage and the other to the handle of Harry's trunk. Make sure you've got a good grip on it, she instructed. I make a lot of these, and it's a really short distance, so it should be pretty smooth. It'll put up a notice me not charm for a few seconds when you land, enough so non-magicals won't wonder why you just popped into existence in Center City. Just say, "Go Eagles," when you're ready to go. Thanks, miss, Harry said, gripping the rope tightly and making sure it was securely attached to his trunk and Hedwig's cage. Go Eagles. This time, the hooking sensation was much less intense, there was no nausea, and, most importantly, Harry didn't end up sprawled on the ground. He looked around briefly, impressed by the amount of hustle and bustle, then began his short walk south to the inn. He arrived in short order, and was, since he had a reservation already, immediately shown to his room, where he divested himself of his luggage, opened up Hedwig's cage, and removed her glamour. She was still irritated at him about the portkeys and glamour, but not so irritated that she'd turned down a handful of owl treats, which quickly calmed her ire. Chuckling at her fickle but ultimately friendly nature, Harry left his room, hanging a "Do Not Disturb" sign and casting collar porters at the door to be certain that Hedwig and his trunk would not be tampered with. Harry left the inn to go take his apparition test, but more importantly, or at least more urgently, his previous brief walk had exposed him to the delicious smells emanating from the numerous food trucks parked alongside the street, which had made him immediately and keenly aware that he had not eaten since his small breakfast. He had left London just after 12 p.m., and it was now almost exactly 7 a.m. in Philadelphia. Due to the time difference of 5 hours, he would probably need 4 meals if he was to attempt to stay awake late enough to shift his internal clock over to Eastern Standard Time, and it was high time for meal number 2. He went to the nearest food truck. Not knowing what was good, and not really taking the time to read the menu posted on the side, he simply parroted the order of the man who went before him, asking for a cheesesteak with provolone, fried onions, salt, pepper, and ketchup. He didn't really know what a cheesesteak was, but vaguely recalled it being one of Philadelphia's signature foods, along with soft pretzels. A few minutes later, he was surprised and impressed with how quickly the sandwich had been prepared. He completed the transaction, peeling off a few bills for the cashier. He pocketed the change, making a mental note to review the American currency after his meal, and dug in. Seconds later, he was doing a credible Ron Weasley impression, sitting on a bench and shoving food into his face. He could see why the locals seemed to like cheesesteaks so much, and got the feeling that he'd be having him pretty often in the next couple of weeks. Satisfied after the large meal, looking at the price, he had expected a sandwich about half the size. He'd have to keep in mind that what he'd heard about American portion sizes was apparently true. He walked the short distance to City Hall. It was a nice building, with a statue of, well, someone at the top. He walked in, following a tall, older man who he had noticed cleaning off his shoes with a subtle flick of his wand. As he had hoped, the man led him to a door that many of the passers-by seemed not to notice. Following the man through the door and down a set of stairs, he briefly wondered how this area didn't get in the way of the City Hall subway station. Before assuming that the answer was simply magic, he found himself in a bustling office lobby with several halls extending out of the main area. The people within were obviously magical. Some were levitating boxes of papers, others were sending memos flying through the air to other offices, and still others were simply too peculiar to be non-magical. Tearing his attention away from the people, as he didn't wish to be caught staring, he noticed a directory conveniently located beside the stairs, and he followed the simple directions down the hall to Apparition Examination and Licensing. After taking a number and standing in line for about 10 minutes, during which time he filled out his apparition license application, he was called up to hand in his paperwork. A rather young wizard, Max, or something like that, met him at the front desk, and upon noticing that he had listed England, United Kingdom, as his place of birth, began chatting amiably about a trip he had taken to London the previous summer. Harry realized that the man probably engaged in light conversation with all of his examinees to calm their nerves and help them pass the test, and, though it was unnecessary in his case, he appreciated the gesture. The man led Harry to what was clearly the exam room, a large open area with several differently colored circles painted on the floor. He followed the Max's instructions to the letter, parroting from circle to circle, and in short order, the man praised his technique and stamped, "Passed," on his application. "Good job, dude," something said. "Have a nice day." Harry politely returned the sentiment and went to the desk to collect his apparition license, which, though issued by the state of Pennsylvania, looked the same as those issued in England. Harry was surprised before remembering that the ICW policy was to issue licenses in the same format as those issued in an applicant's home country. Finished with his business at City Hall, Harry decided to take a test drive by parroting to his room at the inn. Pleased that he had arrived where had intended with all of his parts still attached, Harry put in a quick mirror call to Remus and Sirius, showing them his new license and reassuring him about his safe trip. "What are you going to do now, Harry?" Remus asked. "You've got almost 2 weeks to use Philadelphia as your home base, and portkeys to major cities and attractions around the country are fairly inexpensive. I think I'm going to spend a few days exploring Philly," Harry said. "There's a lot of good history here, and a few really great museums. Nights are probably going to be for summer assignments. I want to get them all done before I go to Wisconsin. Sounds like a good plan, lad, Sirius said. It's a good idea to get your homework done early, especially since the animagus transformation and the magic you'll be learning will be pretty time-consuming and tiring. That said, make sure you leave enough time for fun. All work and no play makes for a dull Harry. Harry grinned, and after saying goodbye, apparated to the sidewalk outside the inn. He paused briefly to consider the moment. He had crossed the ocean, his immediate food and shelter requirements were taken care of, and he was standing at the beginning of a long, exciting road. He squared his shoulders and stood up straight, before turning on his heel and setting off at a determined pace. It was time to start his adventure. Chapter 8. Philadelphia Freedom. Harry was having by far the best summer of his life. He ate whatever and whenever he wanted to. There were no Dursleys starving him. He went to a baseball game, and he even chatted up a girl who was apparently visiting her older sister at one of the universities. For the first time, he felt like he was actually in control of his own life, and he loved every minute of it. Even if he had a minder, he probably still would have genuinely enjoyed his time in the city. Philadelphia had a great deal to offer for the discerning traveler. He went to every major section of the city, in several cases going wherever his stomach led him, for example, to places like Reading Terminal Market. By June 30th, he had gone to several of the major museums in the city, though even he, an admitted Philistine, compared to, say, Hermione, knew that it would take weeks to truly plumb the depths of just those he had seen, not to mention all of Philadelphia's numerous museums, and his favorite by far had been the Franklin Institute. In addition to its excellent non-magical exhibits, it had a substantial magical section, including departments which were actively engaged in research in a number of fascinating fields, doing justice to its namesake, a fairly famous American wizard. In fact, these museums in general, and discussion he had had with a researcher, a middle-aged healer named Edward Hopkins, who had extolled the virtues of several different fields of magic, some not even available for study at Hogwarts, in particular had kindled in Harry a new enthusiasm for scholarship that bordered on obsession. It had helped Hopkins' credibility in Harry's mind that he had also recommended several different nutrient potions for Harry, having noticed instantly that Harry was underweight by nearly 2 stone. If nothing else, he could get back, within a few weeks, the growth he had missed out on from years of malnourishment and confinement at number 4 Privet Drive. If he was particularly lucky, his eyesight, which had been damaged by a decade of straining his eyes to see in his dark cupboard, would also be repaired. Harry purchased the potions that day, not trusting his own skill at brewing for such an important application, and took them as directed. He was hopeful that he would return to Hogwarts taller, stronger, and without glasses, and he vowed to remember that, in all the times he had been under Madame Pomfrey's care at Hogwarts, she had never said anything about repairing the physical damage that the Dursleys had inflicted on him. Since all potions prescribed by a healer in America had to be FDA approved, though obviously in relative secrecy, he was quite sure that he trusted Hopkins's word over Pomfrey's. He was a world-renowned healer with dozens of published journal articles, and she was a school nurse. Aside from medicinal potions, Harry's new academic fixation also led to a book-buying spree the likes of which Harry had not seen since the last time Hermione had visited Flourish and Blotts. Since American wizards apparently printed texts the same way as their Muggle counterparts, rather than slow, labor-intensive 19th-century vintage presses, books were extremely inexpensive, and unlike the tripe available in Britain, often forced upon students by professors looking to line their own pockets. Unfortunately, Lockhart wasn't the only offender, just the worst. Textbooks were all peer-reviewed. Histories were full of verified fact, and when authors speculated or theorized, they were careful to hedge, knowing that their reputations were on the line. Spellbooks included not only descriptions, helpful tips, and suggested uses, but also arithmetic formulae, all manner of graphs and data, and moving pictures of wand motions. Harry bought so many books that he ended up going to the local Gringotts branch to withdraw more funds just to buy more books, and needed to charm his trunk several times with as powerful of a space-expanding charm as he could manage. He was being well served by all these books. Far from being solely for enjoyment, Harry was using them in addition to, and in some cases, in lieu of, his assigned textbooks as references for his summer assignments. As a result, he was plowing through his homework with little difficulty, and at a pace that Hermione would have envied. He had quickly concluded that he would be dropping divination, and replacing it with arithmancy. Professor Vector was known for being an excellent teacher, and he could simply test out of the third-year introductory material to be placed with the other fourth-year students. Ancient runes was also a consideration, but it was primarily memorization through the OWL material, so he would simply self-study it, and sit the OWL at his own leisure. If that went well, he would take the runes course at the Newt level. As these resolutions came to him, he began to wonder why he had let Ron talk him into taking divination. What a waste of time that had been. Had he really been so starved for companionship that he was willing to let Ron dictate the course of his life? The answer after his second year had apparently been yes, but now that was no longer the case. Harry would take the courses he wanted, and if he felt like doing extra work or reading instead of playing chess or talk about Quidditch, which he probably would, now that he had purchased a great deal of reading material that would actually be well worth his time, then he would do just that. During the miracle before dinner, the time difference was currently 6 hours, as Sirius and Remus were currently in Germany, following up on a lead on Wormtail. Harry ran these thoughts by the two older wizards. "I'm glad you're starting to place more value on what you want, Harry," Sirius said, nodding with satisfaction. "Friendship is important, but you need to live your own life the way you want." "I agree," Remus said, poking his head into view. "I didn't want to get into it with you during school, since Ron and Hermione are fairly close friends of yours and I didn't want to offend you, but I think you might have less in common with them than you did at the beginning of your first year. That's okay. Part of growing up is growing into your own person, and sometimes that means growing apart from people you were close to." Harry sighed. "I guess. It's just kind of surprising. Maybe it's because I've been keeping myself so busy between exploring the city and doing my summer assignments, but I haven't really missed Ron and Hermione since you guys picked me up from number 4, and I only really think of them when I do schoolwork, go to a museum, or see someone eat like a pig." Sirius didn't quite get Harry's half-joke, but Remus laughed. "Ah, Ron Weasley. It was pretty unappetizing watching from up at the staff table. I shudder to think how bad it is up close and personal. Anyway, Harry, it's great that you're looking into history and different fields of magic," Sirius continued, still, shockingly, on the subject of learning. "You never know what is going to be useful, and the more you learn, the broader your horizons will be." Harry was surprised by Sirius's sudden ability to be sedate and responsible for the entire conversation so far. That is, until the very next moment, when his thin veneer of respectability came crashing down. "So, have you snogged any colonial girls?" Rolled eyes met his barking laughter, and the rest of the conversation was spent bantering and chatting about lighter subjects. After a hearty dinner, consisting, predictably, of a cheesesteak smothered in ketchup, Harry put the finishing touches on his final summer assignment, thinking, quite rightly, as it would turn out, that Professor Flitwick would definitely be impressed with his work. Harry spent the remainder of the night reading on combating the darker forces of this earth and beyond, an incredibly interesting defense against the dark arts book, originally written almost 2 centuries ago by I. Crane, and periodically edited by his descendants, whose family business was the hunting and destruction of dark creatures. As he turned out the lights and settled in for bed, he turned to Hedwig and grinned. "It doesn't get much better than this." Chapter 9. The Devil is in the Details. The next day, July 1st, was a Friday. Many of Philadelphia's residents had taken the day off to start their weekend by going down the shore, Philly speak for driving eastward to the beaches in New Jersey. Harry was going to visit one last museum in the morning, before embarking on his first side trip. He had picked up some camping equipment at a military surplus store the previous day, and planned to go on a 1 or 2 day trip to the highly magical Pine Barrens of New Jersey. The large, covering over a fifth of New Jersey's land area, densely forested reserve was actually quite close to Philadelphia and Camden. However, it was largely unpopulated by humans. Based on a conversation Harry had partially overheard between 2 wizards in one of the bookstores he had plundered, it seemed to be a fairly tame, albeit exponentially larger, version of the Forbidden Forest, though by some quirk of the area's ambient magic, it was apparently not possible to apparate or portkey within the forest. That was little more than a minor inconvenience, though. He'd simply apparate nearby, and go in on foot. Flying his firebolt wouldn't work, because the canopy would be so dense that he would have difficulty landing anywhere. His goal was to see the famous Blue Hole, a supposedly bottomless lake which was said to be a favored site for some magical creature. Harry hadn't heard what creature it was, as a large family, very like the Weasleys, in fact, except their hair was uniformly brown, bustled in between Harry and the 2 men on whom he had been eavesdropping. as he ate breakfast, a scrapple sandwich, which was delicious, so he didn't want to risk asking anyone precisely what scrapple actually was. While walking, as he felt he had been parroting too much, and was risking getting out of shape, to his destination, Harry's exotic, for him, meal turned his thoughts toward Ron, who would certainly enjoy trying all the different cuisines easily available. As good a cook as Molly Weasley was, she generally cooked a small range of typical English fare. Thinking about Ron quickly led to thinking about Hermione, who would be insanely jealous of his opportunity to visit so many museums and bookstores, and practice magic out of school. Of course, thinking of his two closest companions inevitably led his thoughts to Hogwarts. Based on the book lists for the various American magical schools Harry had found posted at several large bookstores, Harry was beginning to remember the differences between Muggle schooling, as American magical education closely mirrored that of their non-magical counterparts, even including some non-magical subjects to meet state and federal requirements, and the almost obsolete model used in magical Britain, and the former seemed to be coming out on top at almost every turn. And to think that Hogwarts billed itself as the best magical education in the world. Snape could certainly not turn out any great number of qualified potion students, Binns could never hope to turn out any graduates qualified to speak on magical history, and defense against the dark arts was practically a joke. So far, Harry had had only one reasonably qualified Dada professor, and he was forced to resign once news of his lycanthropy had spread, thanks to Snape's pettiness. In an American classroom, Snape would have been fired mere seconds into his first class, for that was how long it usually took for him to begin abusing the children under his care. Binns would never even pass an interview, since he pretty much ran on autopilot, and Remus's employment would have been protected, not persecuted, by equal opportunity and disability protection laws. Harry knew that he couldn't base his entire view of an entire nation on his experience of a few days in one city, but he was quickly becoming impressed with America, and equally disillusioned with the British magical community in general, and Albus Dumbledore in particular. This feeling was fueled greatly by the mentions of Dumbledore in various exhibits at the Philadelphia Museum of International Magical History. He was, after all, a very prominent figure in European magical communities and the ICW, almost none of which painted him in a flattering light. The man was positioned perfectly to drag the British magical community into the new millennium. He was Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, the British representative to the ICW, and, perhaps most importantly, had been headmaster of the largest school of magic in Western Europe for several decades, which he could have used to mold the minds of his young charges toward embracing change and improving their world. If Dumbledore was truly as progressive as he encouraged people to believe, Harry thought, then British magical society would not still be stuck in the Victorian era. Instead, his moves, on the rare occasion that he made any, in the Wizengamot and as headmaster of Hogwarts had always been calculated to maintain the status quo, while every once in a while using some of his influence to help one of his minions out of a tight spot. Even his duel against Grindelwald in 1945, for which he was venerated in Britain, had only come once the war had already been won on the Muggle side, and was effectively over on the magical front, after ignoring a steady stream of ambassadors and heads of state literally begging for his help for the better part of a decade. In short, Dumbledore was basically a wizard version of Hamlet. His default response was always to wait and consider the different paths, paralyzed by uncertainty, and by the time he made any decision, it was almost always too late to do any real good. Harry realized that this must be so that he would be able to do just enough to claim the moral high ground for taking action, but would never make any decision where he could be held responsible if the situation didn't turn out as planned. This extended even to what was arguably the boldest thing Dumbledore ever did. If he had lost the duel to his old friend Gellert, as only in Britain was Dumbledore able to keep his boyhood association and affair with Grindelwald censored from the public eye, he almost certainly would have survived. Gellert still probably would have been captured, as his war was lost and he was far outnumbered, while the fact of his loss would have been justification for waiting so long, and he still would have been viewed as brave just for trying. Either way, he would have come out on top, or at least with his reputation intact. So really, it hadn't been bold at all, since there was virtually no risk. As he thought about some of what he had read about Dumbledore's standing policy of inaction, a thought struck him. Dumbledore had stepped up during the Death Eater trials after the war exactly once, and it had been to save Severus Snape's hide. Despite Snape being a marked Death Eater, Dumbledore had ensured that he was acquitted, Apparently, the political cost was to make no push for Veritaserum against any captured Death Eaters, allowing many to go free, those who could afford to buy off their fellow Wizengamot members, that is. Somehow, Sirius hadn't quite made the cut for Dumbledore's intervention, even though he was known as a member of the not-so-secret vigilante organization led by Dumbledore himself. Probably since public opinion had already been against Sirius, Harry thought bitterly, so it would have been too risky to stick his neck out for Sirius, no matter that it had literally been Dumbledore's sworn duty as Chief Warlock to ensure that everyone, even, or perhaps especially suspected traitors and mass murderers, was given a fair trial. Knowing these details, Harry was certain that he would never forgive Dumbledore for failing Sirius, and, by extension, Harry himself, so completely. The more details he found out about Dumbledore, the more Harry began to feel that, if it hadn't been for the obviously evil, and, in many cases, death-eating, nature of many members of the so-called dark political faction, he might have aligned with him just for the sake of removing Dumbledore. These overwhelmingly negative sentiments about magical Britain and Dumbledore led him, quite appropriately, to the final museum he planned to visit, Independence Hall, practically hallowed ground to Americans and historians, as both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution had been debated and signed there, at 5th and Chestnut. As Independence Day approached, it was observed every 4th of July. Independence Hall and several other places associated with the American Revolution, which had largely centered around Philadelphia, due to the city functioning as the capital of the fledgling nation, always saw drastically increased attendance. This year was apparently no different, as quite a few people were wandering about. He perused some of the writings on display, impressed with the eloquence and passion of the speeches and essays. It was easy to see, given the circumstances, how such words had incited such a dramatic uprising. Of course he could identify with the rebels, Harry thought, chuckling. After all, he was currently several time zones away from number 4 Privet Drive, undertaking his own private rebellion. As he turned to leave the building, Harry's eyes alighted on an exhibit which displayed the progression of flags, ensigns, and jacks associated with the United States throughout history. Most were just variations on the well-known Stars and Stripes theme, but some were very different. The one that caught his eye was among the first. It depicted the words, "Don't tread on me," emblazoned beneath a rattlesnake on a yellow field. Harry read the brief description. Apparently it was called the Gadsden flag, after the designer, who was a general and a delegate to the Continental Congress. He had seen several examples of the rattlesnake being used as a symbol of early American independence in several museums, including the Franklin Institute and the Philadelphia Art Museum. That had originally surprised him, as the European magical communities, and the British in particular, almost universally associated snakes with so-called dark magic. It must be just another way the US was different, he supposed, resolving to find out the details of why the rattlesnake had been so prominent of a symbol. Putting it out of his mind for the time being, he apparated off to the food trucks near City Hall. After all, there was a food truck nearby that served heavenly-smelling falafel sandwiches, and that was, at least for now, much more intriguing to the rapidly growing, courtesy of his nutrient potions, teenager. After wolfing down his falafel sandwich, who knew that fried chickpeas could be so delicious, Harry apparated back to the inn to prepare for his trip to the Pine Barrens. He gave his kit a quick once-over, an expansion-charmed canteen, which he could refill with aguamenti if he ran out of water, several electric camping lights, a tent, his boots, an old U.S. Army rucksack, a sleeping bag, an extendable shovel, both of his wands, several daggers of varying sizes, which Sirius had made him bring from the Black family armory, several, to-go, boxed meals under preservation charms, and his firebolt. He also packed a small potions and antidote kit, which included 2 bazaars. He doubted he'd need them, but he wasn't very familiar with American flora, so he figured it was better to have and not need than to need and not have. Finally, he threw a spare pair of jeans, several spare sets of socks and boxer briefs, his light jacket, and a few spare t-shirts into his rucksack, and decided that he was as ready as he was going to be. Harry figured that a short side trip into the uninhabited forest would also be an excellent chance to try out some of the more high-impact magic that he had been reading about in the spellbooks he had bought, having taken a break from his study of Crane's book on dark creatures in order to skim over Offensive Magic for Defensive Mages, by Henry Earp, a magical descendant of the illustrious Muggle lawman Wyatt Earp. Ironically, if his new academic determination had driven him to delve just one chapter deeper into the Crane text, or if he had overheard the entirety of that conversation about the details of the Pine Barrens, he almost certainly would have chosen a different destination. Any other destination,